Hi, this is James, and I'd like to welcome you to the first part of my video series on my personal Lenormand card meanings. So this video series was inspired by two viewers, Miss L and Carla, who both at different points in time asked me if I would consider the idea of making a video or videos detailing my personal associations with each of the Lenormand cards. So I want to thank Miss L and Carla for giving me the inspiration for this video, and I also want to take a moment to acknowledge everyone who watched that intro video for your kind words, for your support and your encouragement, and the level of excitement that you each had for this series going forward. So I just want to take a moment to thank you all. I couldn't do this without your support and encouragement, so thank you. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the first 6 cards of the Lenormand. So that's going to be Rider Through Clouds. And the deck that's going to be joining us through this exploration, through this series, is the same deck that I used in the intro video. So we're going to once again be helped by La Faneuse Lilac Dondorf. And so just as I did in that intro video, I will be leaving a link to that information about the deck if you feel inclined to want to know more about it or how to get it. I will leave that information in the description box below. So, okay, without further ado, let's get to the table and take a closer look at the first 6 cards in the deck. And here we are with the very first card in the Lenormand deck. This is the Rider. And my first go-to keywords with this particular card are news and messages. If you watch the intro video, right before this particular video in my series, then you'll remember that in the line of 5 reading I did, this card appeared, and those were the words that I associated with the card, keeping in context with the question. So remember, and I'll stress this repeatedly probably throughout this video series, is that you want to use words that fit with the context of the question. That's always key with Lenormand. So as you're creating your list of words, always ask yourself which words best fit the context of the question, right? So for me, news and messages is usually my first go-to with Rider, because that tends to fit regardless what the question is. So news and messages are my first go-to keywords. Then next, I would also look at Rider as a visit or an arrival, because he's on a horse that's moving, right? So it's very important at this point to probably mention direction. If you read with direction, then you want to pay attention to where is Rider going. If there's a card to the right, that may give you some more idea as to what the news and message is about, or what the visit and arrival pertains to, because that's where he's moving into. In regards to news and messages, could also be too, you want to pay attention if there's a significator card, a person card on this side. This could be indicative, of who's receiving the message, because Rider is going in that direction. So we have news and messages, a visit or an arrival, and going with some other possibilities, and they carry kind of the same theme as those first 4 words that I've mentioned, is I tend to think of Rider as a courier. You know, somebody who's delivering news and messages, or delivering a parcel or a package. And now that I said parcel and package, those are some of the other keywords that I have: parcel, package. You know, you want to think of like somebody who is in a position to deliver something. So a courier, and then along those lines, a mail carrier. You know, I mentioned parcel and package. Then another one would be mail, because that's a form of receiving news or messages, you know, checking your mail. And with that also too, I mentioned being a courier, so there's delivery, that's another keyword. And then if we're going with the more descriptive aspect of Rider as a person, I tend to look at him as an eligible young man, or sometimes the other man. If you're doing a reading or you're addressing a question about the possibility of another person being involved in a situation between 2 people, then this could suggest like there's an arrival of a third party. And in my particular case, because remember I'm sharing some of my own personal experiences, sometimes I've had the great pleasure of reading for people who are in same-sex relationships, or, exploring, same-sex partnerships, same-sex relationships, romance, things of that nature. And sometimes if I don't have a deck that has 2 men cards or 2 women cards, then in the case of a gay male relationship, I tend to look at the writer as, the partner of a gay person. So that is just me in my own little world that I live in. Some people may not ever have that experience and ever need to associate writer with that, but that has shown to be the case for me. And again, that's only in the instances when I don't have decks that have 2 men cards, because I actually prefer those, because I don't want to take a card out of context. Then writer could serve in another function. But if I don't have that as a possibility, then I use writer as the partner of a gay man. Right? And then going with the image, we talked about the person on the horse, but what about the horse itself? So for me, rider can be anything that has to do with horses. So this could be somebody who is an equestrian, somebody who is a jockey, somebody who deals with horses in any shape, form, or fashion. So there's that. Also too, if you go with the image, he's riding a horse, so it's anything that we ride or drive, right? So this could be, somebody who rides a horse, but it could also be somebody who rides a bike or a motorcycle, or even a car, a vehicle, something that forms some sort of transport. And going with that, now that I mentioned transport, I also see this as a travel or movement card, but I also look at it with like short distance commutes, or something over land, because he's on ground. So when I'm thinking about travel, I would be thinking about like traveling in a car or by bike or by motorcycle, but travel over land. And so we have another card that represents travel, and I'll talk more about that, because sometimes these two can make the distinction in terms of the mode of travel, right? So those are some of my keyword associations for rider. And so now we're going to move on to the next card. And so now we're looking at card 2, which is Clover. And so for me, my immediate go-to words for Clover are luck. If you go with the idea like a 4-leaf clover, then you think about luck, and fortune. That's another one of my words for Clover. And then if you think, sticking with the 4-leaf clover meaning for the card, then it could also be a charm. If you stop and think about a lucky charm, so going with that, it could be a charm, so an actual charm that we hold on to, or something that we envision as a charm, or something that's going to bring us luck. So anything that we have that's a tangible physical thing that we think is going to bring us luck, then Clover could represent that. It could also represent the idea of being charming, right? So there's that. So it could be about a charm or something that's charming. Another one of my main go-to keywords for Clover is opportunity, right? So I tend to look at this as an opportunity or a chance, something that's going to be beneficial. And then I tend to have a flip side to this card too. If we look at something as an opportunity, then we get to determine if it's something that we want to take a chance on, or if it's something that we're going to look at as a risk or a gamble. And so with that, I tend to look at Clover as a risk or a gamble. But now in terms of risk, right, this card can represent, a small risk. So like if you're looking at the risk potential, Clover would suggest that the risk isn't going to be that high or that great, because I tend to look at Clover as something that's small, right? So there's that. Now, Clover can represent money, but I tend to look at it as a small amount of money. And so it would be like a bonus of some kind. And then going with that idea of money, and maybe with the idea of a gamble or chance, or, because then I start thinking about games of chance. And so this card for me can represent the lottery. It could represent sweepstakes. And if you were to win, it could suggest like a small win, right? It wouldn't be like you would win like the $1 million jackpot. You know, it would be like a small win. It would be like, for me, I'm thinking, to kind of keep it relative, like you win a scratch off. Like you take a scratch off and you win something with that. That would be Clover. Right, so there's that. So there's lotteries attached to that, sweepstakes attached to that. You know, in terms of attitudes, this card can represent the need for spontaneity, or to be spontaneous, or to have a carefree attitude. And with that, if you go with the idea about luck, then the attitude could be like, I'm going to be happy-go-lucky, right? Now, for me, in terms of timing, when this card shows up, and we talked about opportunities and chances, you know, good luck, this card could suggest two things. Number one, something that's going to be brief. You know, it's not going to be long term, it's going to be short term. That's my other thing. So brief or short term. So something in the short term. So like if there's an opportunity, the window of opportunity attached to that may be very short, right? Or very brief. And that may be where the idea of like, are you going to take the chance, or are you going to look at what are the risks involved, especially if you don't have a lot of time to act on the opportunity. So there's that. Now for me, because I told you some of these things are personal to me. So one day, and this is one of the personal aspects for me, one day I was outside in the backyard of my house, and I was pulling weeds, of all things. You know, so I'm pulling weeds, and it made me think of this card. All of a sudden I saw Clover in my mind. So Clover in that context for me can also represent weeds, because now remember, Lenormand is also very literal, and Clover grows out of the ground, right? So it could represent weeds, right? So you could stop thinking about like being in the weeds, you know, or having to actually pull weeds, you know, that for me. So I could see Clover as maybe I need to pull weeds if I'm going to be outside, you know, mowing the lawn and things of that nature. There may be weeds that need to be pulled up. In keeping with the idea of things that grow out of the ground, then this could also represent greens. You know, so if we go with the idea, we'll talk about, because I'm thinking of another card further down the line, but if we're talking about diet or food, then this could be like maybe incorporating more greens into your diet. You know, so there's that. And then the last thing I think of with Clover, keeping with the idea of weeds and greens, would be plants. Again, things that grow out of the ground. So those are my keyword associations for Clover. And so now we'll move on to the third card in the deck. And so now here we are with card 3. And card 3 in the deck is the ship. And so for me, my immediate go-to keywords for ship are travel or a journey. Those are my first go-to keywords. So I want to mention, since I mentioned travel, at this point, I want to mention back to rider. You know, I talked about the idea with rider. Rider could be about short distance commutes, right? Or travel by land. This would be longer distance commutes. So something distant, or travel over water, because the ship is actually over water. So that would bring in some other aspects of the card that I'm going to now mention. So going with that, ship can also represent something foreign, something abroad, something overseas, right? So there's that. For me, ship is also a card that can represent commerce or a venture, if you go with the business. So if you're doing a business reading, perchance, then this card shows up. One of the possibilities could be it's talking about something commercial, going with the idea of commerce, or something related to a venture. There's that. Now again, going with the literal aspects of ship, it can actually represent a ship, and then going with that, then something having to do with shipping, right? And then going along those lines even more, I sometimes see this as import and export, right? So going with the travel aspect of the card, this could represent a cruise, being on a cruise, and then with that, an actual cruise ship. You know, maybe something smaller scale if you have cards around it that describe size. You know, and something smaller in nature. It could be a boat or going boating. And then keeping with the foreign, you know, aspect of the card, something overseas, something abroad, then this could be international, something international. Whereas rider might be something that's more domestic, keeping with the land versus water aspects of the cards. So those are some possibilities. Then for me, I tend to look at ship as something having to do with progress, advancement, and moving forward. Again, going with the idea that the ship is in transit, you know. And as I've said that, it just popped into my mind another word. It's a variation on shipping, but this could be like transporting something, you know, something being transported, and going with that, then transportation. For me, when I work with Lenormand, I tend to look at Lenormand as something having to do with words and grammar and things of that nature. So some of these keywords that I'm talking about are just variations of the same word, you know. So it's like, you know, coming up with different words, and those other words could fit different contexts. So I'm seeing that with the ship. So now another aspect of the ship card for me, and I don't normally see this very often, but for me, keeping with the idea about a ship and water, then this could be something having to do with possibly the Navy, you know, or something naval. You know, something having to do with, if we go with the water, something like marine. There's something having to do with marine or marine life. And then with that, going like somebody who's in the Navy. So it could be like a sailor, you know, something of that nature. Somebody whose occupation is about, you know, traveling abroad or being on the sea. So those are some aspects for me for the ship. And so now let's move on to the next card in the deck. All right, and so now we're at card number 4, which is house. And so my first go-to keywords with house are an actual home, something having to do with an actual home or house, keeping with the idea that Lenormand, again, is very literal. So first go-to is you want to look at your house, your home, right? And then the other thing here with house is about family, and with that, it's about the nuclear family. And I'll talk more about that in comparison to our very next card, because both those cards talk about two aspects of family. But when the house card comes up, it can represent the nuclear family, and with that, it would be like the people we actually live with. So for me, in my particular case, it could be family, but if I go with like who lives with me, I live alone. So I don't share living space with anyone else. But if you do, you might not live with family. You may have roommates. You may have a husband, but you don't have any kids, or a wife and you don't have any kids. You may live with other family members that, you know, that kind of thing. But it's like whoever you share living space with. It's like people who live under the same roof. So that would be some aspects of house. Now, other aspects of house for me are comfort, because house is a place where one tends to feel comfortable, so it can be about comfort. It can also be about foundation, you know, going with that, the idea of like having a home base. That's another one of my things, home base. You know, if you stop and think about headquarters, that's another aspect of house. Now, this is relative to me. I tend to look at house as a home business, or somebody who works from home. And that's really relative to me because I work from my own house. I have a home business. And so I see clients in my house. I have a home office, you know, that kind of energy. So it could be people who work from home or have a home-based business. And with that too, it could also be, going with the more business aspect, people who have a small-scale business. You know, so it could be like a person who has a small shop, or a family business, or you know, like a boutique, you know, something small, something that when you walk in makes you feel like home, you know, or it makes you feel a sense of comfort. So there's those aspects if we're going to make it about business. Another industry or business that is connected to house is real estate and property. So this could be somebody who actually works in real estate, you know, works in property. Could be like you're actually looking at real estate. If you're contemplating a move and this card comes up, it could represent, you know, either the house that you're selling or the house that you're planning on buying, or that you're looking for homes, possible homes to consider, that kind of energy. So those are aspects of house for me. And then here's one that is personal to me, and it would be surrounding cards would have to kind of move me in this direction, but it kind of fits with the idea about having a home business or home-based business or working from home. If you go with the idea of home, then this card can represent like the home page on a website. You know, it's like it's the first page on your website where people land on, right? And they get a sense of whether they want to do business with you or not based on how they feel. Do they feel comfortable with the presentation on your home page? That kind of thing. But I tend to look at this as home pages on websites. Now, up to this point, this card is the first card in our 6 cards that we're exploring for this video that has what we call a face card or a person card. This is the King of Hearts. So for me now, this has a dual meaning. It could represent, you know, something having to do with home, you know, property, real estate, business, things of that nature, but it could also refer to a person. So with that, if we go with the person aspect of the card, then I tend to look at house as the man of the house. If you go with the idea like the king is the head, you know, the king is the person who's in power, control, authority, leadership, then it could be the man of the house or the head of the household. And when I say head of the household, that doesn't necessarily mean that the King of Hearts has to be a man or a male. You know, whoever's just in charge, whoever just runs the house could be the King of Hearts in that regard. But if we bring it back to the male gender, then house with the King of Hearts could represent a husband, a father, or a family man. So those are my aspects of the house. And so now let's move on to the next card in our video for today. And so now we have tree. And my first go-to keywords with tree are health and healing. This card is about anything having to do with our well-being. And so that could be, depending on surrounding cards, it could be physical well-being, it could be mental well-being, it could be spiritual well-being. You know, and I'm thinking, oh, emotional well-being. I was about to say I left one out, and I just remembered because it has the insert of hearts. And so hearts for me can represent feelings, emotions, and relationships. So it can also represent emotional well-being. So those are the first keywords that I would go to with tree. Tree can also represent life. And I go with the idea of the tree of life, you know, from Kabbalah. So that for me is how I derive life for tree. And then for me, because I already talked about spiritual well-being and emotional well-being and mental well-being. So for me, tree can be a card of growth and development because trees grow over time and they develop over time, right? And so that could be of a personal or spiritual nature, that growth and development process. Now, I mentioned about trees growing over time. So another aspect of tree for me can be about time itself. You know, and with the idea of time, this would be something that would be a long time. And because trees take a long time to grow, with that, it would be asking us to be patient. So this card is also about patience, right? Now, here's the aspect of family that I'm going to bring in with this card that I talked about with house. So for me, this card is also about family, whereas I talked with house about being the nuclear family or you know, family that we actually live with or, you know, live under the same roof with. This card can be about extended family if you go with the idea about a family tree, and that's where this all comes in. So a family tree consists of extensions or branches of family. And so that would involve aunts, uncles, cousins, you know, and then extensions of that like great, because I'm thinking about my nephew, so I'm his great uncle, you know, extensions like that that go beyond the nuclear family. So there's that. And with that, now, if we're talking about family tree, some other aspects with that would be things having to do with ancestry, lineage, heritage, you know, all of those. If you start thinking about like family history, that would be tree. So there's that. With that, if we go with the idea of like the branches of the tree, then you could think about like some sort of system, you know, because every system has its branches, right? So there's that. And I also tend to think of like, since branches represent something that's extended, then the word extension can also be with that. And then going with the idea about family and heritage and lineage and things of that nature, I also think about roots. And sometimes this could be about like we're looking at a situation, and sometimes tree can represent like what it's rooted in, and that would bring like the foundation that we talked about with house, the previous card, back into play here. So something, we're looking at the roots, so it could be family roots or, the roots of a situation, what it's rooted in. Right, so there's that. And then this is one of my own personal ones, going with the idea about branches. Sometimes I see this card as giving us advice about branching out. And so the inset here, I'll try not to talk about the playing cards too much for those who don't read the playing cards, but for me, the Seven of Hearts is a card connected with tree that can represent like developing connections, and so that's where the branching out comes in, right? So now going with the literal aspect, this card can actually represent an actual tree. And so for me, keeping it relative, I live in Charleston, South Carolina. And so there is a tree that's called the angel oak tree, and it is a massive tree, right? And so sometimes I think of that tree when this card comes up. So it can actually represent an actual tree, but it can also represent something made of wood. If you go with the idea that, a tree is wood, then it could be like, something that is made of wood if we're using tree to describe something, right? And based on surrounding cards, you may read cards as one card is the subject, right? If we look at the diagram that I have here, the first card can be the subject, and then the second card would be how the subject is either being described or that the action that the subject card is taking, right? So tree is on the right side of something, and we're using it as a descriptor. It could be saying like that thing is made of wood, depending on the subject matter. So those are my keyword associations with tree, and so now we'll move on to the final card in this video. And here we have the sixth card in the deck, and this is going to be the last card for this video, and this card is the clouds. And so traditionally speaking, the clouds is said to be the most challenging card in the deck, right? So for me, my first go-to keyword associations with clouds is confusion, uncertainty, being unsure of something, and having doubt about something. Right, so those are the first go-to keywords I have with clouds. Now here are some other ones. Going with the very literal aspect of the card, I tend to look at this as air or atmosphere, right? So for me, clouds can also represent, going further with that, it could represent fog, something foggy, haze or something hazy. It could represent literal clouds, and with that, something cloudy, like a cloudy day. For me, since we talked about air and atmosphere, I sometimes see this card as anything having to do with the head. So this could represent your mental atmosphere. And if we go with the idea of tree being a card that can represent health, the former card, then sometimes as a combination, if we talk about tree being about health, then this card would be like looking at one's mental health. And so some aspects of that could be somewhat challenging with clouds could be depression, and something being overcast, right? And so now here's something really literal with clouds. And I'm saying this in light of what's going on outside my window right now as I'm filming this. So for me, clouds can literally represent inclement weather or stormy weather. And it's raining outside as I'm filming this. So it could be like stormy weather, inclement weather, weather that keeps us indoors, or weather that's not safe to be outdoors in. So those are some literal aspects of clouds. And I just love the timing. I said in my first video, my intro video, that I'm a big believer in looking at patterns. And so it's very interesting about synchronistic events. Oh, and as I'm mentioning that, it's very helpful sometimes for me to talk out loud. Synchronicity is another aspect of Clover. So if you're taking notes, You might want to add that to your list for Clover, synchronicities. So if you're a spiritual person and you're looking at patterns and the way the universe operates, sometimes Clover could be those little signs of synchronicity. So there's that. Okay? So if you notice, we now have another face card, because here we have the inset of the King of Clubs. So again, now this card can also represent a person. So for me, I tend to look at the King of Clubs, keeping with the aspect of clouds, as somebody who's very cerebral, you know, somebody who's in their head. So that could be somebody who's a thinker, somebody who's an intellectual. Those are the positive sides. The negative sides, or the challenging sides, could be somebody who's confused or dazed, somebody who's foggy, somebody who's forgetful, right? And then with that too, if we go with the literal aspect, and as I'm talking, you may hear the rain is really starting to come down, then this could represent somebody who is a weather person, right? So just keeping it relative. So I want to thank Mother Nature for helping me with that one, right? So the last thing I want to talk about with the clouds cards as I'm wrapping this up is that when the card comes up, you want to pay attention to what card is on the darker side of the clouds and what card is on the lighter side, because the card that's on the darker side could represent the more negative aspect of the situation, what's being highlighted negatively, right? And as the card on the left side of clouds would be the side that's clearing up, so to speak, right? And as I'm mentioning the words clearing up, the last thing I want to say about clouds is that even though it's the most challenging card in the deck, one thing to remember when it shows up is that clouds can be something that's fleeting, because clouds literally move in the air. They literally move on, right? So just remember that. So when this card comes up, remember, like, whatever the challenge is, it's fleeting in nature. It's going to be temporary, because clouds do eventually move on. And so on that note, I will wrap up video 1 of this series. And so in the next video, we're going to be talking about cards 7 to 12. So we'll be starting with the snake and ending with birds. And so at this point, as I wrap up, I want to again mention that I will have the keywords that I've shared in this video in the description box below. And I'm also opening it up for people sharing the words that resonate with them, or if they have other words, you know. Just because I'm the one doing the presenting here doesn't mean that I am the authority and that I am the know-it-all or the be-all or end-all when it comes to Lenormand. I am still learning, just like each and every one of you who lands on this video. So if you have some words that might help me, you know, that might expand my vocabulary with Lenormand, I would love to hear them. So if you feel like you want to leave those in the comment section below, that would be great. So again, this is James Himm Mitchell, finishing the first video in our series of my Lenormand card meanings, and I look forward to having you return and share the same space with me as we continue on our journey. So until then, I'm hoping that you have a wonderful day, and take care.